Some moments in history aren't just events. They're more like sparks, a single, powerful idea that catches, grows, and just becomes a fire that's way too big to contain. That, right there, is the Industrial Revolution. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to trace how that one little spark completely reforged the world we live in.
The core idea was pretty simple, right? Mechanization. But this is the key. It wasn't just about building a few factories or inventing steam engines. Oh no. It was a technological fire that literally leaped across borders, creating unimaginable wealth, forging a whole new global order, and igniting a debate about how we should live and work. A debate that honestly, we're still having today.
All right, so here's the game plan. First, we'll see how that spark got out of Britain in the first place. Then, we'll watch as America catches the fever and how that fire eventually went global. We'll explore how that shifted world power, and then we'll dive right into the great economic debate it created. And finally, we'll look at the legacy that we are all still living with.
Okay, so it all kicked off in Great Britain. They were the first to the party, and they knew they had a massive advantage. So for a while there, man, they did everything they could to keep this incredible new technology all to themselves.
And get this wasn't some friendly suggestion. It was literally the law. Britain forbade its skilled workers, the people who actually knew how to build and run the new machines, from leaving the country. They were trying to lock it all down to build a total technological monopoly.
But come on, a secret that valuable? There's no way you can keep that under wraps. So you get these guys like Samuel Slater, who was, for all intents and purposes, an industrial spy. He memorized the design of a spinning machine, hopped over to the US, and just rebuilt it from memory. William Cockerell did something pretty similar, smuggling plans into Belgium. And just like that, the spark was out.
And nowhere did that spark catch fire faster or burn brighter than in the United States. It just had all the right ingredients. Tons of natural resources, rivers for power, and a growing population that was totally ready for work.
But to really get a feel for this transformation, you got to look at the people who actually lived through it. People like the mill girls. We're talking about thousands of young women leaving their rural homes behind for these new factory towns. For the very first time, they had a real chance to earn their own wages and get a taste of independence. This was a whole new world for them.
And this quote here from Lucy Larcom, she was a mill girl herself, it just sums it up so perfectly. She talks about this satisfaction of having time that was entirely their own. You have to remember, for a lot of these women, the alternative was being a servant. So as tough as factory work was, for many, it was a massive step toward personal freedom.
Okay, so if the factories are the heart of this new economy, then you got to think of the railroads as the arteries. And the growth of those arteries was, well, it was absolutely staggering. What we're looking at here is the US in 1840 versus just 50 years later in 1890. This is the network that allowed goods, resources, and people to move at a scale and speed that had never been seen before.
Let's just put a number on that for a second. We're talking about going from less than 3,000 miles of track to over 200,000 miles in just half a century. That is just an insane level of growth. And building something that massive, it required a completely new way of doing business.
So the big question is, how on earth do you pay for all that? Well, the answer was another crucial invention, the modern corporation. To raise the unbelievable amount of money they needed, entrepreneurs started selling stock, which are basically just tiny pieces of ownership in their company. Anyone who bought that stock became a part owner, and these new businesses, owned by all their stockholders, were called corporations. This whole model, it was a total game changer, allowing them to raise these massive amounts of capital.
Now look, the American story was super dramatic, but it wasn't the only one. This industrial fire, it just kept spreading from the US across Europe and eventually to Asia, with each country kind of putting its own spin on it.
And you can kind of see the path of that fire right here on this timeline. You've got Belgium jumping in early thanks to guys like Cockerell. Germany starts copying the British model, building railroads to connect all its rich coal and iron deposits. France's approach was a little more measured. And then there's Japan, where it was this massive top-down government-led push to modernize the country almost overnight.
So this global fire, it didn't just change how we made stuff. It fundamentally rewrote the rules of who held power on the world stage. It created this entirely new kind of global hierarchy, one that was based purely on industrial might.
And here's the first huge consequence. A massive wealth gap opened up between the countries that industrialized and those that didn't. This economic divide would go on to define international relations for the next 100 years, and you could argue, even today.
So why did that happen? Why this huge gap? Well, because the factories in these new industrial nations were hungry. They needed a constant, steady supply of raw materials, and they needed new markets to sell all their finished goods. And this hunger led directly to imperialism, this policy of controlling other lands to secure those resources and markets. Basically, the industrial engine needed colonial fuel to keep running.
Okay, so with all this change, the new factories, the corporations, the global inequality, you get a massive philosophical debate. It really forced people to ask some really fundamental questions about how an economy, and even a society, should be organized.
And it all kind of boiled down to this one huge question. In this brand new industrial world, who should be in control? Should it be private business owners, or should it be the government and the community as a whole?
Well, one of the first big answers came from thinkers like Adam Smith. Their idea was something called laissez-faire, which is French for, basically, let do or leave it alone. The philosophy was simple. The government should keep its hands off. Let owners and businesses operate freely, and this invisible hand of the market would create progress for everybody. And this table here, it really lays out the two huge competing visions that popped up. So on one side, you've got capitalism. It argues that private ownership, self-interest, and competition, that's what creates the most efficient system. Government shouldn't interfere. And on the other, you've got socialism. It argues that for the good of all, the community or the state should own property, that progress comes from cooperation, and that the state has a duty to protect workers and make sure everyone's needs are met.
And then you get the most radical version of that socialist argument, coming from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. See, they weren't interested in just reforming the system, they wanted a full-blown revolution. They saw all of history as a class war between owners and workers, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And their famous call to action was simple: workers of the world, unite and overthrow the system.
So, after this fire just swept across the globe, what was left in its wake? What is the lasting legacy of this whole revolution? The answer is pretty simple, really. It's the world we're all living in right now.
I mean, the impact of this revolution was just profound. It led to the creation of labor unions to fight for workers' rights. It spurred huge social reforms in things like public health and education. And it created this large, powerful new middle class that started demanding a bigger say in how their countries were run, which, in turn, fueled the growth of democracy itself.
And that, of course, brings us right back to today. Sure, a lot of those old factories are gone now, but the fundamental questions they sparked, they are more relevant than ever. In our own age of massive technological disruption, with things like automation and AI, we're still wrestling with that exact same challenge. How do we balance the engine of economic freedom with the need for social fairness? The debate that was ignited by that first industrial spark, well, it's still burning.